Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion with Mr. Alain Fischer. We're sorry for the delay, but there was an interview that was going on. And without further ado, I let Mr. Laluza introduce this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Dear President Fischer, dear Professor Trier, dear Professor Jopard, dear colleagues, dear student, how are you? Are you well? Okay, I hope. Okay. So we are so honored, of course, to have such a great scientist here. Before I start, I would like to thank you all for your presence, and also I would like to greet our students who are online, so could not join us physically here today, but across campuses. You know, this is very important topics, major challenges for the future. And why this is important? Because, you know, we're living in three main challenges. First, ecological transformations. Second, technological transformation. Third, societal transformations. That's why, thanks to the unique, great partnerships with the French Academy of Science, I don't know if you know well the Academy of Science, it's a young institution of more than 360 years old. You can imagine, so older than ESCP Business School. How come it's possible? This is important because they will provide you the best challenges, the main things that you should know about what's going on. For example, of course, today we will, thanks to Professor Fischer, we'll discuss about the pandemic. But after that, we will discuss about the carbonization of industry and then the impact of AI and so on. So many topics that will have a big impact on our society. So I would like to thank, of course, the president of the Academy of Science, Professor Fischer. I would like to thank, of course, Professor Antoine Trier, the permanent secretary of the Academy of Science. I would like to thank Professor Claude Jopard, of course, the delegate in charge of education, to provide her this series of conferences. You know, as future responsible, accountable leaders, you, dear student, you have to have a scientific mindset. At the same time, you have to have, is what we are preparing you, to have this intercultural managerial mindset. Because this is the two sides of the brain, of your brains, to make you unique and to serve our society for a better world, a peaceful and healthy world. So that's why, once again, I would like to thank the Academy of Science, Professor Alain Fischer. Do you know him, Professor Alain Fischer? He's a very great scientist, immunologist, world-renowned, of course. And he's a specialist about the pandemic. You know, he was the president, he served as the president of scientific committee for the French government during the COVID period. So he was the man who provided us about what's going on about the pandemic, about the management, about the anticipations. So this evening, we are very lucky to have him on board and to share with you what's going on. And also, you can ask him many questions about that. So before I leave the floor, and to, of course, Professor Antoine Trier, I wish you a great evening and conference and debate. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm Antoine Trier. I'm the secrétaire perpétuel. This cannot be translated in English. It's not perpetual. Perpetual is something different, you know, from secrétaire perpétuel. But and I'm always very sad because people do not understand. So this means that we are the I am with another one, the executive at the Academy of Science. Well, I present myself. I'm a neurobiologist. I'm a researcher. I'm working at École Normale Supérieure, and I am a member of the French Academy of Science, and I became the secrétaire perpétuel. Well, since few years, I have been involved in trying to organize links with higher education to disseminate scientific knowledge. And this is very important to bring non-scientific higher education to bring really the knowledge of today. And what we wanted to do, and what we succeed, is to establish a collaboration with ESCP, and the program that has been drawn up with the school comprise 6 conferences, and this will really, we hope, enhance dissemination of science. I'm talking about scientific culture. We don't intend to train research practitioners here. The concept of culture is central to apprehend with critical, circumspect, and very high or brave new word, where the multiplication of information, dissemination vectors such as social networks, TV channels, and so allow the rapid spread of fake news and the influence of unqualified people with sometimes harmful ideas. We are convinced that this initiative is particularly timely at a time when the place of science in the decision-making and planning processes of our society is far from secure. We are in a global world where scientific advances are rapid, leading to the emergence of technologies whose impact can be difficult to control. This has several consequences. First, users and citizens are confronted with new tools and procedures that they do not understand. And second, the initial training acquired during schooling is no longer appropriate and no longer enable to the progression of knowledge to be followed. Scientific breakthroughs often have side effects that are difficult to predict and which can affect fields far removed from science. This is a case, for example, of what is called dual-use research, which can sometimes be of concerns. Biological research is particularly concerned. Research aimed at modifying pathogens as part of a fundamental research or applied to make new vaccines can also be used to develop dangerous tools for bioterrorism or rogue states. This is also the case for artificial intelligence. With its rapid development and the significant increase in the number of researchers, the world of high-level research is becoming increasingly complex and remote from society. The scientific methods and the procedure for verifying and validating scientific results are generally not understood by most citizens and are increasingly called into question. This is where critical eye and/or call to truly expert advice is called for. Determining who are truly expert and preferring them also require critical judgment. It's for all these reasons that ESCP and the Academy of Science have decided to organize a series of lectures debates, giving students the chance to talk with leading researchers about fast-growing disciplines and their futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Trier. You know, it's very fascinating to join our collaboration, to have this excellence in terms of course, our entrepreneurial spirit, and also, of course, to have the excellence of the Academy of Science with their very scientific spirit. I want to salute, of course, my dear colleague, Professor Praman Bunkanvicha, Dean of the Faculty, Praman Bunkanvicha. Also, I would like to introduce, thank you, Professor Frédéric Jala. He's the scientific director of our great special masters in biopharma management. Thank you. And I would like especially thank, the international political societies led by the president Arthur de Cazaux here, who, with his members, organized this great evening. So now, without further ado, let me introduce Clément and Arthur, who will provide a portrait of President Fischer. Thank you very much.
This evening, the ESCP International Politics Society has the great honor of hosting world-renowned immunologist Alain Fischer. Born on September 11, 1949, in Paris, his career has been marked by exceptional contributions to the field of immunology and genetic diseases. He's particularly known for his pioneering work in gene therapy, a revolutionary medical technique treating rare diseases by directly correcting defective genes in the patient's cells. Alain Fischer comes from an intellectual family deeply involved in social causes. Brought up in this environment sparked an early interest in science and medicine, as well as his desire to contribute to the well-being of others. After studying medicine at the University of Paris, Alain Fischer specialized in pediatrics, drawn by his interest in children's health and the rare diseases that affect them. He soon turned to immunology, a field that was rapidly expanding at the time. He then became a researcher for the National Institute of Health and Medical Research, INSERM, where he focused on immune disorders. Studying congenital immunodeficiencies was a major turning point in his career. These rare diseases, which weaken children's immune systems, leave them highly susceptible to infections. Fischer discovered that some of these diseases caused by genetic defects, and that these effects could potentially be corrected. His research led him to explore gene therapy, an innovative approach at the time. At the prestigious Necker Hospital in Paris, Alain Fischer achieved some of his most notable successes in gene therapy. In 2000, alongside his team, he managed to treat children suffering from a rare genetic disease called severe combined immunodeficiency, SCID, often remembered as bubble boy disease. These children, born without functional immune systems, were forced to live in sterile environments to avoid infections. The success of this gene therapy, which involved inserting a healthy gene into the patient's stem cells to correct the defect, was a historic breakthrough in medicine. Although these initial clinical trials faced some complications, included cause of leukemia due to the method used to introduce the corrective genes, the overall results were extremely promising. Fischer's work not only paved the way for curative treatments for diseases one thought incurable, but he also laid through the groundwork for modern gene therapy, which today is a reality for other conditions. Alain Fischer is also a renowned educator. As professor of pediatric immunology at the Collège de France, he has trained many researchers and physicians who continue to advance the fields of immunology and innovative therapies. He also served as director of the Imagine Institute for Genetic Diseases, which he co-founded, a world-renowned research center located at Necker Hospital, dedicated to studying and treating rare genetic diseases. Under his leadership, the center became a reference in treatment and research of rare genetic disorders. In addition to his scientific work, Alain Fischer has played a key role in critical health debates. Indeed, in 2020, he was appointed by the French government as a special advisor to the COVID government response, a crucial role in the national COVID-19 vaccination trust strategy. His appointment came at a critical moment as the world was striving to contain the COVID-19 pandemic through mass vaccination campaigns. Fischer, known for his integrity and scientific rigor, helped ease public concerns about the new vaccines and guided the rollout strategy in France. Throughout his career, Fischer has received numerous accolades for his work. He's a member of the French Academy of Science and even the president, and has been awarded several prestigious prizes, including the Louis Janté Prize for Medicine for his groundbreaking contributions to science. This is why I'd now like to call onto stage Mr. Alain Fischer.
So, good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very proud to be the first speaker in this cycle of conferences joining the Académie des Sciences annual school. And thanks for your introduction. That was too kind, by the way, but that's the game, I would say, the rule of the game. So what I'm going to discuss with you is the issue of pandemics, and maybe a little bit about the past and how we can consider the risk of pandemics for the future and what to do. The worst pandemics we know occurred in the 14th century. This was the so-called Black Death, the plague, that occurred both in Europe and Asia. And this led, for instance, a few years later to this beautiful tapestry you can see in Angers, the tapestry of Apocalypse. And one of the panels showed the death, which is the Black Death, although it doesn't look black. But this is the death, and they are the poor people who are going in some kind of, I don't know exactly what kind of instrument, but they are dying. So this is the representation of those who survived of this Black Death in the 14th century. And you will see in a few minutes that this was a real tragedy. So perhaps to start, I should define the words, important words I'm going to talk about: pandemics, epidemics, and endemics. Pandemics is an infection that is spreading all over the world, as the Black Death was, and as the COVID was recently. Epidemics is more an infection that is spreading, but it's limited to a region. For instance, this is what is ongoing every year with seasonal flu, where at given times, October, November, December, we have in Europe, on the northern hemisphere, the flu, whereas 6 months later, when there is the winter on the southern hemisphere, they have the epidemic. So this is a difference. And finally, endemics are infections that are present continuously. Could be worldwide or restricted to some areas. Two examples everybody knows about: HIV is present everywhere, unfortunately, and it's still there, and TB, tuberculosis, who is today still the infectious disease that kills the highest number of people every year in the world, about 2 million people. Okay, so once you know what is a pandemic, we can proceed. Is this one? Yes. So a little bit of history. This figure shows you pandemics we know about over the last 2,500 years. And in green, the black line, not the black, excuse me, the green lines, they represent the number of deaths. Well, of course, there are estimations in the past. But you can see, for instance, that 400 years before our era, there was a first known event of plague. For instance, Thucydide, the famous Greek writer, talked about this plague. So they estimated somewhere 100,000 people died from it. So later on, about 500 years from our era, there was the second plague pandemic, the so-called Antonine plague, 5 million deaths estimated. A third one, no, 500 is now, I made a mistake. So the third one is plague of Justinian in the Byzantine area, but then diffusing, as you will see. So you see that now we have 25 to 50 million deaths. So this is increasing. Of course, the number of people living in the world was also increasing. And then we come to this Black Death, estimation of 200 million deaths. Just imagine 200 million people died within maybe 5 to 10 years. Then we have the smallpox. That's a more important pandemic everywhere in the world. Here is written 60 million in the Renaissance time, but actually the smallpox was there all along. It was almost endemic up to the time a vaccine was developed that has now abrogated completely the occurrence of this pandemic. And you can see in the recent period of time, more pandemics. Maybe this is significant that there is a tendency there are more pandemics occurring now than it was the case 500 years or 1,000 years ago. But of course, there could be a bias in terms of it's easier today to recognize that there is a pandemic than it was the case 2,000 years ago. So you can read cholera, influenza. Immediately after the First World War, there was a major pandemic of flu that killed more people than the First World War itself. So this is important to recognize. And of course, more recently, HIV and the COVID, with approximately 20 million people who died from it. So it's a short history. The major point is that most of these infections actually are what we call zoonoses. It means that the microbe, the bacteria, in the case of the plague, or virus, in the case of COVID, for instance, they were first infecting animals, and these microbes evolved, mutated, and so on, so they became able to infect humans. So, of course, the interface between animals and humans is a critical issue for the development of zoonoses. So these are, on this table, I will not go into the details, but you have a list of human infections that are zoonoses. So they came from animals, could be different kind of animals, like you can read on the right-hand side of the slide, like bats, quite for instance. Two of them are pandemics, so the flu H1N1 in 2009 that didn't kill too many people, fortunately, but it came from a virus in the swine, and of course the SARS-CoV-2. But you see there are many others. So I have no time to tell you why they did not develop into a pandemic. They remained limited, fortunately. There are reasons we understand, we know more or less why, but of course some of them may start again and lead to pandemics. A few words about the plague. So this is caused by a bacteria that was identified by Alexandre Yersin, a Pasteur scientist, but he was working in Hong Kong. So it's creating lesions with the bubon marked by the black arrow. And we know that these bacteria can be propagated mostly by fleas and rats. So this is typically a zoonose, but there could be also interhuman transmission. So a bit, again, some more illustration about epidemics, between epidemics and pandemics. This is at the limit here. So this is the one of the Justinian time. You can see it started somewhere in the Middle East and propagated at least to Europe and Africa. And it was present during 200 years. So it was not limited for a short amount of time. Here is the famous Black Death. So this is what occurred in Western Europe, but you have to realize that the bacteria probably originated from Kyrgyzstan, circled in red. So it propagated to the west, as shown here, but also to the east. And it killed a lot of people in China, for instance. And you can see the propagation from 1338 up to 1353, waves of propagation with movement of people and rats, by the way. And this was a disaster. We have some good figures about London because they have very good statistics in terms of death in London. So at that time, approximately half of the population of London disappeared within 2 years. Just imagine half. Let's imagine that half of the population of Paris will have disappeared between 2020 and 2022 with COVID, for instance. So it was a major disaster, and it is estimated that between 25 and 50% of the population living in Western Europe died around 1350, and the same in Asia. So this was a major crisis of humanity that occurred at that time. Of course, at that time, there was little to do to fight pandemics or even to prevent pandemics. Nobody knows about these microbes that were identified at the end of the 19th century, for instance. Okay, let's move to COVID, because then we can draw some lessons of what we can do in the presence of a pandemic. As you know, COVID is caused by a virus, so-called a coronavirus, that is causing a respiratory infection, not only a respiratory infection, but mostly a respiratory infection. And this is a serious disease. Just a few figures. The first wave of the pandemic in France occurred at the first trimester of 2020. And during this first wave, approximately 5% of the population was infected, and it led in the death, as written, in 30,000 people. Okay, only with 5% of the population infected. Of course, at that time, there was no protection, no vaccine. This was the onset of the pandemic that started in China, as you know, in November, December 2019. An important aspect is that the virus is mostly killing old people, as shown by the figures here, but not exclusively. Some young people died too. So everyone is exposed with a different risk. So of course, we cannot extrapolate fully that if 5% of the population leads to the death of 30,000, that if we multiply by 20, so let's everyone will be infected, we'll have 600,000 deaths. This is not correct because there is some attenuation that occurs, but still, when this was realized that there was an explosion of the pandemic, of the infection, and of course at the same time it occurred in Europe, first in Italy, and of course in some other countries, and there was some data from China. So the politicians and the health authorities had to take decision what to do to limit the extension of such an infection that was extremely transmissible from people to people. So this led to the measure. Before discussing the measures, just another illustration of what occurred now in India. In India, there was a peak of infection in May 2021 with a new variant of the virus. The virus is evolving all the time by mutations. So in May 21, in the city of Delhi, this is shown on the second cartoon, almost all of the population got infected by Delta. So it's not the 5% I mentioned of the first wave of the infection in France. This is now close to 90% of the inhabitants of the city of Delhi, 20 million people, something like that, were infected. And this led to a major health crisis we don't know the exact figures, but there were deaths everywhere. The hospitals were completely in a chaos because of the number of people. So this is just to say that this pandemic was a very serious one, and this was absolutely devastating. So everything had to be done, and should be done in the future to prevent such extremely bad events. So what can be done? So as you know, the decision in France and in most, not all, but almost all of the European countries was to decide of a lockdown, which is of course a major decision given the consequences, the economical consequences. I mean, this is obvious, but also the psychological consequences, for instance, of the closure of schools, which are still present today. This is not an easy question, but it worked. So the decision was well taken. Today we can say perhaps it should have been taken a little bit earlier, but of course the earlier you do it, the better it is in terms of limiting the extension. But it worked. So this is why there were only 30,000 people who died from COVID between January and April 2020 in France. But of course, how do you go to such a decision of lockdown, which is really not an easy one to take? Then this is where the collaboration between the experts, the scientists, virologists, immunologists, clinicians, epidemiologists, people able to draw models of the propagation of the disease. Those guys played a very important role to advise the politicians to come to a decision. And so this was based on this modelization, as well as, and this is absolutely critical, I will come back to that, to raise the trust of the population, because you can decide a lockdown, but if the people continue to go into the street and do not obey, then it will be a complete disaster. So you have to explain. You have to explain it in a fair way, honest way, a way that is intelligible by everyone, so that the population adheres. This is not so easy, because of course, as you know, each time there is a crisis, this is generating anxiety, and anxiety is generating fake news. And this is the context of fake news, so you have also to fight the fake news, and this was the case in France as well in the US and in many other countries. And this is even worse when sometimes these are the politicians themselves that are developing the fake news, like Trump in the US or Bolsonaro in Brazil, for instance. This is very complex. So, but in France, at least the decision was made and was efficient. But this is not going to stop the pandemic, because once you relax the lockdown, the virus is still there, and most of the people have not yet been infected. They are not protected, so it will come again. And you will have several waves, one after the other, and this is again, would you lock down each time for X weeks? Difficult decisions to take. So it requires, again, I mentioned that there should be a way of effective interaction between experts of different fields, including also social sciences, by the way, and the politicians to take the decision. So in France, two councils were created, the council advising about the general decisions on like the lockdown, that was the council head by Jean-François Delfrécy, and then a council I was responsible of about the policy of vaccination. I will come back on vaccination in a second. But let's have a look at how the pandemic went in France. So you have four kinds of figures: number of cases in blue, number of hospitalization in orange, in critical care hospitalization in red, and death in black. And here you see that with very few cases, you had a lot of death. This is the first wave. But then you have many more cases, actually, but the number of deaths was reduced. And it was reduced for two reasons. One, because the evolution of the virus that became less aggressive, and the fact that with time, of course, this is also based on vaccination, people became more resistant, at least to severe infections. But globally, this was the consequence of the measures that were taken to limit the pandemic. So one important measure, once it is available, is the vaccine. So in the context of COVID, this was really a fantastic story based on science, advances, I will not go into details, but major advances in science and vaccination based on basic research for many, many years. But also this was an economical, political mobilization, mostly, I have to say, unfortunately, coming from the US. Europe has not been that active, but there was the so-called Operation Warp Speed, where the Congress decided to put immediately $10 billion to be used by pharmaceutical companies to develop as quickly as possible the vaccines. And it worked, since in less than 1 year, several vaccines became available, mostly those based on RNA, but others too. And this was a fantastic success, as you will see, because it led to control, at least in some countries, the pandemic. This is good news for the future, because it suggests that for the next pandemic, we should do the same, perhaps even more rapidly. Though there is a caveat, it doesn't work always. Just I put it on the bottom. You can see, for instance, for HIV, despite the fact that we know the virus now for 40 years, we still do not have a vaccine. So it doesn't work for all viruses. So this is a great promise, very important advance that can be used to control new pandemics, but it may not work. And in that case, things will not go well. So for instance, in France, the campaign of vaccination worked pretty well. It was done by age group, progressively, but at the end of the day, not of the day, but after 2 years, approximately 93% of the population over the age of 12 years was vaccinated, which is quite successful, though not perfect, but it worked. And overall, worldwide, it is estimated that this vaccination led to spare 20 million lives. Okay? So if there will be no vaccination, at least there will be 20 million people who have died in addition on top of the 20 million who died. So this is quite successful. These are data from the US. You can see the columns as a function of age, and you can see the vaccinated people had the risk of dying much, much reduced compared to the non-vaccinated one. I will skip that. Oops, sorry, it went too fast. But then there is another issue. Okay, so the Western countries are wealthy, relatively wealthy, and they can use and mobilize a huge amount of money, as the US did, and they have the pharmaceutical companies to go ahead to develop vaccines, or perhaps drugs, that are efficient. But this is not the case in many other countries where the resources are limited and the consequences are really problematic. This slide shows you the rate of vaccination, people having how many people were vaccinated among 100, so a fraction, comparing people coming from high-income countries to low-income countries. I mean, this is obvious that the vaccination of people in poor countries was a failure. Despite a certain number of attempts, it was a failure. And this is translated in health, but also in many other aspects. In terms of mortality of COVID, if you look carefully by age, you can see when in blue, the blue countries are the good ones. I would say those where the death rate was relatively limited. Whereas if you go to the yellow, orange, and red, this is bad. For instance, in Africa, it is thought that in Africa that COVID-19 was limited. This is not true. If you look at the right age, it was much, much worse than it has been in Europe. So poor countries had many more deaths, and obviously this is a major problem of how can we handle a pandemic that is, viruses do not stop at the border, they are everywhere in the world, and how can we manage in the future a pandemic affecting both the rich countries and the poor countries. So what's next now? Where are we? Well, there are threats. For instance, there is a virus, a flu virus, H5N1, this is its name, that is present in cattle. It's a virus that comes from birds. And this occasionally, the virus can be transmitted to humans. There is no human-to-human transmission, fortunately. But a few people working with cattle have been infected. And you can read that the death rate of this virus is 50%. Okay? 1 out of 2 people infected have died from pneumonia. So up to now, this virus is not propagating from one person to another. But let's imagine tomorrow it mutates. It will be a potential catastrophe. So these kind of viruses have to be under very, very strong surveillance in terms of, we'd say, molecular epidemiology, sequencing of the viruses everywhere they can be detected. They have been found in the US, but also in other countries. So if the virus mutates to become transmissible, this is an issue. So there are some, like that, a number of threats. So how can we be prepared for this? When the risk is identified, this is a risk that is identified. We know this virus, but of course there are many others we do not know. We have to check in many families of viruses. So what can we do? Of course, once we know the virus, vaccines can be prepared. In the case of this H5N1 virus, it is estimated that 8 billion doses could be manufactured in the world in 1 year. This is not bad, but actually we would need 16 million because we need 2 doses per person to vaccinate all of the planet. So this is limited, so we won't be able to completely curb the pandemic if it occurs. And so this is the question, who will get the vaccine? And obviously, as it was the case for SARS-CoV-2, for COVID, the national governments put the priority on their own population, which is understandable, but this is a major problem because, of course, it's an ethical issue to have people without protection and others being fully protected, but also in terms of health and thus in terms of life, economy, and so on. If a virus is persisting, it may mutate in the places where it's still propagating and come back, even in the wealthy countries, with now a virus that is resistant to vaccination. So a good policy is not only to vaccinate people from the rich countries, but to vaccinate people from all over the world. And that implies to have an efficient worldwide organization. And this is not an easy issue, obviously. Okay, by the way, it is estimated, of course, estimations are always wrong. You know that in economy, but it is also the case in health. But it is written in many papers that it is estimated that there is something like a 50% chance that there will be a new pandemic within the next 25 years. I don't know whether this estimation is correct, but what is absolutely certain that the question is not will it be a new pandemic, but when. And it could be in 5 years from now. So what are the measures to be taken to be prepared? Some of them are listed here. So to be prepared and to develop and manufacture diagnostic tests, this is extremely important to recognize world-infected people, to isolate them, for instance, to treat them, to prepare the manufacturing of vaccine and drugs, therapy if there is one. But also, and this was an issue, as you know, in France and other countries, to manufacture protective tools like masks, gloves, gowns, in order to avoid propagation from one person to another. To produce and buy critical drugs and devices, for instance, respiratory machine, to help people to breathe when they have a severe pneumonia. And there was a certain time during the pandemics a shortage of such machines. So we have to be prepared and have them ready to go if necessary. By the way, it's important to have nurses and doctors, and you may know that this is an issue worldwide. There is a shortage, growing shortage of healthcare people. So we have to work on driving more young people to go into health work. So to have the manufacturing facilities, either in the country or somewhere close to the country, and then, mentioned that already, to implement a microbiological surveillance worldwide, not only in France or in the US. It has to be done in Africa, so in countries where it is less easy, and especially, of course, looking at humans, infected people, but also to animals living in close proximity to humans, like bats, but also rats, mice, cats, dogs, and so on and so on. And this is the so-called One Health monitoring program that is not so easy to implement. And this is costly. It has been estimated in the US that it should cost at least $10 to $15 billion a year just for the US. So it's extremely costly, and it has to be done, again, worldwide. It requires an organization because it has to be worldwide. National, obviously, that's not too difficult, at least in wealthy countries. It should be regional. For Europe, we have the advantage to have the European Union, and we may build on that. There is a beginning of a European initiative named ERA to be prepared for the next pandemic, but the money put in it is still quite low. And worldwide, with the WHO, we need the WHO. It's a very critical organization. There are problems because it doesn't work very well. There are too many political issues, fight with the Chinese and so on, and the budget of the WHO is ridiculously low. So we have to work on that to be prepared in the future. Okay, so this was about logistics and money, but also there is a major issue that is trust of the population, because the politicians will decide that the population should be locked down or accept the vaccination, and this is something that has to go quickly, but so it requires to communicate in an appropriate way, fair way, intelligible, and also including the fact that sometimes we do not know what is going to happen. So this has to be honest. And this is absolutely critical that the population will accept measures that are going against their own interests and own freedom, for instance. And this is a major issue. And from time, today, for instance, if in France and we announce, there is a new pandemic, you have to stay home, this will be difficult because people are really fed up with COVID, and even vaccination will not probably be accepted so easily. So this is a major problem. I will skip because that will be too long. The fact vaccination is generating resistance, and sometimes you have to go through over only raising confidence, but to use coercion. For instance, in the context of COVID in France, it was observed in July of 2021 that only a bit less than 60% of the population was vaccinated, and that the rate of vaccination was slowing down because there was a fraction of the population who still were hesitating. So in that context, that was not satisfactory in terms of reduction of severe cases and deaths of COVID, it was decided to create the so-called health pass. You may remember about it. There was a lot of criticism about it, but it was decided, and within hours, hundreds of thousands of people went to vaccination, and the end result was there was a gain, you can see with the blue curve, in vaccination, whereas if there hadn't been a health pass, we will have the red curve with with a much lower rate of vaccination. So just to say that, of course, to raise trust is the first goal, but if necessary, some coercion of the population for the general interest of the population should be used or could be used. I will go to the conclusion. So we can say that pandemics are part of the human history. We know that, and this is going still to be part of our history in the future, that's for sure. And the conditions of living of humanity have probably increased the risk of zoonosis because we are more frequently in contact with animals that can carry such microbes. But there are good news too. Scientific advances have made, so scientific research, have made much more powerful and rapid the identification of cause and the development of diagnostic, preventive, and, sorry for the mistake, therapeutic tools. Just to illustrate the point, for the flu of 1917 that killed 50 million people, the virus was identified 70 years later. For HIV, that started in 1979, it took 4 years to identify the virus. For COVID-19, it took 1 month. So thanks to science and technology, we can go much faster, and we are able to develop in a much faster way countermeasures. But still, it is an issue, as I said, of having the right logistics worldwide and to have the population to adhere to the measures that propose. So it requires sustained investments, and today we are not there. The investments worldwide are not sufficient to be really prepared for the next pandemic. And generous international collaboration, by generous, I mean that people from the wealthy countries should accept, and including the companies, the private companies that develop the drugs and the vaccines, they should accept that they have to share their products, but also their benefits with everyone in the world. And as you know, this is not an easy task. Thank you for your attention. Okay.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So we will take questions, but we will start with 3 to 4 questions, and then we'll give the floor to the room, so you can start preparing your questions. And during our preparatory discussion with Mr. Fischer, he was able to reply on any topic. So it could be, you could ask something very scientific, or you can ask something very different on economics or geopolitics. So, Mr. Fischer, thank you for this presentation. You talked about trust, which looks like one of the major challenges of maybe the 21st century, or maybe it was the case before. So you were also very involved in the vaccination campaign, advising the French government. How does it work in practice behind the scenes? Do you have an actual communication strategy behind that, or is it is something very organized and structured, or like how do you fight people like Novak Djokovic who would say that vaccine is not the best thing, for example?
Yeah, this is, as I said, and I just reiterate, this is key for the control of pandemics. One is learning by doing very often in this situation, but hopefully for the future, this will be better prepared and structured. I mentioned the principles. Those who know have to communicate. The politicians have to communicate by definition, hopefully, especially in democracy, but also the scientists have to communicate. This is not the same communication, because the first ones, they take the decision, the second one, they advise, but they can explain what are the issues, what's going on, what are the risks, what are the chances, why it is important to accept not to go to work anymore, or to work at home only, or to be vaccinated. But this has to be done very honestly. If you start to provide wrong groups, that will be a catastrophe. So this has to be done very, very carefully. And this is major. I think for the COVID, it worked reasonably well, despite the fact that a number of people were propagating fake news, including a few of my colleagues in medicine, so especially from Marseille, but not exclusively from Marseille. And those guys were really troublesome. And I think here there was a failure. Now, from the scientific community, we have to organize a way. This is not easy because freedom of speech is also respectable, but we have a way to try to control our colleagues when they start to propagate fake news. And most of the fake news in health, and especially in the context of pandemic, originate from the medical world, not from the common population. And here we have to work on that. We have to do better. Some regulations have to be passed to organize this control. I don't have a solution like that, but this has to be taken into account.
We also had a question regarding, because you said how, you talked about how COVID-19 and many of the pandemics are zoonoses, and we wanted to know, you brought actually two subjects. One was the idea of monitoring diseases before they become epidemics and then pandemics, and the other one is the human contact with animals. And my question would be regarding all the human interactions with animals and the increased human interactions even today due to climate change and the urban expansion. How could we kind of monitor these? Should we monitor these interactions? And how could they be monitored actually practically on the field?
Yeah, well, this is very difficult. And I thought you were even going to say, can we prevent this interaction? That's just impossible because it will be a complete change of way of life and go back to the time 10,000 years ago before agriculture started. So this is not realistic. No, the best we can do is to test as often as possible humans on one side and animals that are living close to us. And to do that regularly. And again, the difficulty is that you have to do it everywhere in the world. And so practically, it's not easy, but attempts have to be done because that could lead to the detection of, at the very early steps, of new microbes or microbes starting to infect people. But I am not totally, completely optimistic, given the importance of the task and the cost it represents. But we have to work on toward that direction.
And perhaps another question to bounce back on something you said. So you talked about the fact that it was necessary to put in place microbiological surveillance, and you said it was estimated at around $10 to $15 billion per year. What means do we have currently in the world to do this type of surveillance? And are we near the 10 to 15 billion or not at all?
No, it's 10 to 15 in the US. It's not only for surveillance, it's for everything. That is to have enough to be able to generate and to have stocks of gloves, of gowns, to have drugs that are necessary to take care of people who are severely infected, have pneumonia. It's a lot of things to be done. So we are quite far away still tonight. Just to give you an idea, the European initiative, the European Union, HERA, H-E-R-A, so far has collected €1 billion.
So if the room wants to start asking questions, it's fine. Okay, great. Could we have people passing the microphones, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Professor, Doctor. It's a true honor, I think, to have people of your caliber coming to ESCP, just showcasing again the dimension of the school and your association as well. The first question I want to ask you, I have so many in mind, but perhaps to start, when you say regaining this trust, how does that happen? Because you also talk about the propagation of fake news, and you talk about how politicians like Trump could divulgate fake news. But when it's someone like Didier Raoult, which you mentioned, which has a resume of hundreds of pages, which is recognized as one of the leading pandemiologists in the world, how do you discredit such a source as fake news? Thank you.
Yeah, this is not an easy task. Well, of course, if a political leader is propagating the fake news, that becomes very difficult. Although in the US, it was very interesting to see that the main advisor of Trump was still Tony Fauci, who is a great scientist and was a fantastic person in advising how to handle the COVID, and he resisted Trump, and he resisted threats, including to his life, and he was able, even in the context of having Trump behind him, to divulgate and well, at least he was able to convince, I would say, a small majority, but a majority of the US population to go ahead along the lines of what should be done. But of course, this is particularly, and in Brazil, it was a disaster almost everywhere. So of course, in countries like in Western Europe, mostly, where the politicians were much more wise and tried to do their best to limit the pandemics, though communication is easier, not easy, but easier, of course, facing Raoult and other people. But I just have to repeat what I said. I mean, people who are real experts have to communicate, and to communicate properly in a very honest manner. I mean, I reiterate a very important point, that is, we should say we don't know when we do not know. And of course, when the pandemic starts, if the journalists ask you how many people are going to die, you don't know. So you have to say, I don't know. So I think we can get more trust by being honest, by rather than trying to provide answers to all questions. But there is no general rule. You have to, as on the web, you have to, as far as we can, to counteract the development of fake news, or even worse than fake news, are real news misinterpreted. I mean, this has been shown that it is the worst situation. Misinterpretation of real news. For instance, that someone died after a vaccination. Oh, this is because of the vaccination. No, this is not because of the vaccination. So these things have to be corrected. We should do better on the control of the web, but that's a very difficult issue. Of course, if you see the X situation today, this is very bad, potentially. Other websites are more open to some control, as you know. So this is also an issue to be tackled, and this is again an issue that is worldwide, not only in France, of course.
Any?
Can I do a follow-up, please? Is it possible?
Sure.
Just, I'm sorry to. When you say controlling what is being spread online, were you part of the people who made the decision to restrict some information on Twitter? And because I was wondering before, when your colleague was speaking, when he says that some people don't have the education to understand medicine and the implication between claims that politicians, doctors make. Well, isn't that the same case with an economic professor who is in charge of the budget of a country, when he's talking about figures that perhaps us as students will understand because we're learning this, but that any other French person who doesn't study doesn't understand it? Should this person also not be able to express his opinion because most of the people don't understand it? Or maybe we should have a freer platform where everybody can educate themselves.
No, I think you touched a very important point, that is education. And of course, the better the population is educated, have some ideas how science works, for instance. The doubts, not the relativism between opinions. Scientific facts are not opinions, they are scientific facts. They can be criticized because this is how science advances. But I mean, these kind of things have to be, at least in part, understood by the population. The question of probability, statistics have to be better understood. So education plays a major role, but of course, by definition, education is a long-term project. But it has to be done. We have to improve the education of our children to prevent them to believe in fake news too easily. So again, this goes with the ability to try to deconstruct these fake news, generally speaking. But this is not an easy thing. We see that in modern countries where education is relatively developed, there is also an increase in the propagation of fake news. So the issue is in front of us, but the education is a major point for many things, including how to behave in the context of a health crisis.
Bonsoir, Professor. So I have a question about more politics and vaccination campaign. So I'm 23, and in my life, I experienced 2 vaccination campaigns. One was in 2009 for the H1N1 flu, and the other one was the COVID one. The H1N1 was classified as a big failure. It was under the supervision of Roselyne Bachelot, for the Minister of Health. And the one of the COVID one saved billion people, as you were saying. So my question is, French talking, how come the 2009 flu vaccination was a big failure, and what was the difference between back in the days and the 2021 one?
There are 2 major differences. The first one is that fortunately, the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 didn't kill too many people. It was much less aggressive than what was expected. And this is, of course, good news. But this is easy to say today, oh, wow, this was nothing important. Well, at the beginning, nobody knew. And the risk could have been to have a pandemic like the one of 1917. So it was absolutely reasonable to propose, as the WHO did, to have a general campaign of vaccination. It was not a posteriori useful, but we didn't know, so it had to be done. So the second point now relates to how the campaign of vaccination was organized. Then I think the government at that time made a mistake. That is, they considered that general practitioners, GPs, doctors, should not be involved in the vaccination process, and that it should be done with the army, because the army is well structured, as a good logistics. And this was a major mistake. Why it was a major mistake? Not because the army is unable to vaccinate people. They can do it. But the problem is that, back to trust, who are the people that the general population is asking for when they want information about their health? This is their doctors. If you ask the population, 80% of the population will say the first priority is the doctors, then comes the pharmacist, then the media, So if you exclude the most important source of information, you made a big mistake. And the doctors were quite upset, of course, to be excluded from the campaign, and of course didn't play the game. So this is the explanation. Unfortunately, we had to fight a little bit, because some people were still at the very beginning say, well, let's do it with the army, blah, blah, blah. No. Have the people who are very important in being in between, say, the experts and the deciders and the population to play their role. That is, are the healthcare people. So, and fortunately, in many countries, including in France, many healthcare workers were involved in the vaccination. Doctors, of course, but nurses, pharmacists, and others. And this was a very key point. One, because they vaccinated up to some days, up to 1 million people in one day, which is just in France. It's not bad. And secondly, because they were those who provided the right answers to the population. again, question of trust. So that's a lesson for the future, that's for sure.
I think we had one question. Oh, okay.
Bonsoir. Correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, COVID-19 originated in China. After looking at one of the maps that you had up on your slides, China seemed to have some of the least casualties in the world. How accurate do you believe these figures are? And if they are, which steps do they take to mitigate the effects of COVID-19?
I think the honest answer is we don't know. I mean, this is true that if you look at the figures, China did very well and was able to quickly control the propagation of the virus. Is it true? I don't know. What is certain is that the Chinese, and of course in a system like theirs, where there is no democracy, no opposition, no discussion, they could impose immediately major lockdowns, major ones, much more strict than the ones we had in Europe, say. So probably, I mean, certainly this had an effect to limit the dissemination of the virus and the number of cases. But as low as they pretend, I'm not sure. But it's difficult to tell. If you have a way to know, please tell me. But by the way, in 2022, when there was a little bit of protest in some places in China, they were unhappy by the way that they were still under lockdown. The Chinese people started to ask questions. I remember once I had the visit of people from the Chinese embassy as well as people coming from China, and they did the same in other countries. So please tell us, how did you manage the vaccination campaign? And at that, after they say consulting people worldwide, they relaxed their lockdown. So I think there was probably a little bit of political pressure from the population that could not accept anymore to be isolated in a very strict manner. But still, what was the best result where the disease, the infection was the most efficiently controlled were in islands for obvious reasons. New Zealand, for instance, did very well, but this is obvious that they can control the entrance of the country. So these are special cases.
So, good evening. Thank you very much as well for attending today. My question is also about the trust. So before you stated that in the COVID time, for example, when the vaccinations decreased, like the people haven't been so interested anymore in taking the vaccine, the health pass solved this problem because like more people trusted the vaccine. But for me, like my question was because I haven't like understand completely why the health pass, for example, would regain trust in the population, because it was more like about pressure, I would say, because like people have been pressured to take the vaccine because they didn't want to be excluded. So and I also maybe think that this had as a consequence that people that were very against the vaccine didn't want to take it because of the pressure. Like they have been saying, okay, if they want to force me, I will resist. So I don't know, it was just like my thinking. So I wanted to ask you, if there would be another pandemic, would you also say the way to go is that you should apply pressure on the people to vaccinate? Or would you say maybe there is another way to convince even the people that would not comply under pressure? Thank you.
It's a good question. Obviously, the pressure did not increase trust into vaccination, that's for sure. But it was efficient to have more people vaccinated because, as you said, people wanted to go to the restaurants and to social events, so they had to prove that they were they were vaccinated. Obviously, if trust, so information, lead to a level of trust that is strong enough, that it happened in a few countries, not many, but in a few countries, this is obviously the best way to go, to have the people convinced of the importance of the measures. By the way, for the lockdown, it worked perfectly well. I mean, in France and other countries, it was very well respected. very well respected. It's interesting to notice. For vaccination, it was a little bit more difficult, but not so difficult. It was a little bit facilitated by the fact that not everyone could be vaccinated immediately because there were not enough vaccine doses. So it came progressively month after month. So this was good because the first people who were vaccinated, they talked to their family, to the people with whom they work, and there was a kind of auto-conviction of the importance and the safety, by the way, of the vaccination. But then if you face a situation where you have a pandemic, and for maybe because you didn't well about information, a fraction of the population doesn't want to be vaccinated, and you know that if they are not going to be vaccinated, you will see, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of deaths and major consequences on hospitals and economic life and so on. I think one has to do something. And then coercion becomes an issue, a possibility, an opportunity. It's not the first choice, but if required, it has to be used. And even actually, it went even a bit further. For health workers, at the time, there were approximately 20% of health workers in France who didn't want to be vaccinated. And this is just not acceptable because we want the health workers first to be examples for the population, also to be able to work, not to be sick, and third, not to disseminate the virus to their patients. So it was decided that vaccination for them was absolutely compulsory without exception. And I think this is that was a reasonable decision. Of course, there were some resistance, but actually very limited, although it made noise in the media, but practically speaking, it was, with the exception of what occurred in the Caribbean, French Caribbean, special issue, but elsewhere. But this is also the case in other countries like Italy or Germany, where they did the same. It worked. So I think one has to adapt to the situation. To have confident people is the best solution, but if not, you can go to pressure and even to obligation, because this is the general interest.
I have a question regarding the pharmaceutical industry. So thank you for being here tonight. What do you think the pharmaceutical industry, what role do you think they have to play in the context of a pandemic compared to the COVID-19? And what do they have to improve in the context of a stronger regulation regarding clinical trials and market access, for example?
Well, we need them absolutely because they have the capacity of producing billions of doses of vaccine. They have the technology, and they adapted to the new technologies, so they are critical partners. Then they made a lot of money, and one may discuss a little bit whether this was reasonable in a context where, as I showed you, a number of people in the LMIC countries were not vaccinated. And I think there they should do better. I think they have to cooperate better to have all of the population in the world, or at least most of the people vaccinated. And that money is no longer an issue for those people. Not for us, it's okay. So I think they have to be a little bit less capitalistic in the free market way. We have to, this requires some regulation, which is not an easy issue, but it's an important one. But we need them, that's for sure. And actually they did well. They got the money from the Warp Speed program from the US and a little bit from Europe. For German companies, they got some money from Germany and the European community. And in that context, they did extremely well to develop the vaccines in less than 1 year. This is a fantastic performance.
Professor, thank you very much for a very nice conference. In terms of geopolitics, you emphasized that the US were dominant, but you know better than I do that BioNTech was generated in Germany. So what is the reason why Sanofi, Merck, Germany, GSK didn't take the lead and Pfizer took it?
Yes, good questions too. So, well, the US companies were in a better situation because they had access in priority, not exclusively, but in priority to these 10 billions of US dollars that was put immediately made available from the US government. This is probably the only decision by the Trump administration that was a good one. But this was really a good one. And by the way, non-US companies could also have access. Sanofi got access to that money too. But still, of course, it was an advantage for American companies. So BioNTech, they were very smart because they developed, together with Moderna in the US, the first RNA vaccine. But it was a small company. So by their own, they couldn't produce the billions of doses one needed. So they had to make a deal, make a contract with a big company. Why did they choose Pfizer? I don't know exactly. I think there were some human interactions. People knew each other. So this is why they choose, rather than a German company, for instance. So now for Sanofi, it's another story. Sanofi was in the game, but the project of Sanofi failed. They had a project of a vaccine. It didn't fail, but it came very late, much too late. So that's a little bit troublesome about the capacity of Sanofi, despite their financial resources, to be in the competition. That's a little bit troublesome. For Merck, that's another story. Merck was behind the concept of vaccine of the Pasteur Institute. There was a smart idea that was to use the measles vaccines to modify it by introducing a sequence of the spike of the virus into the measles vaccine, which is a fantastic vaccine. But unfortunately, it didn't work. So this is really unlucky, because it could have been a great success for France with the Pasteur Institute, then for Merck. But this is science. I mean, not everything works in science, as you know. So there are different reasons why, while France was absent, practically speaking, the vaccination, and that globally the US dominated. But still, the Germans did pretty well, and the UK too, because they had the vaccine developed by the Oxford University, bought by AstraZeneca, and this was not a perfect vaccine, but a vaccine that helped a lot.
So,
hello, thank you very much for your presentation. You talk a lot about virus and vaccines, but there is also antibiotic resistance, which is a very big issue, especially in a one world health system. So I would like to have your opinion on that and how we could stop the antibiotic resistance globally.
No, this is a bit outside the field of pandemics. That's why I didn't discuss it. I am not, by the way, a specialist of antibiotic resistance, but you are absolutely correct. This is a major issue. And recently there has been a report indicating that there may be 50 million deaths within the next, I don't remember, 10 to 15 years in the world because of antibiotic resistance. There has been some progress in the way antibiotics are used. Well, antibiotics are used in humans, but not only in humans, or in animals. And this is clear that there has been a misuse of antibiotics in the cattle, and this has to be very firmly regulated to protect the right usage of antibiotics. And then, of course, I hope that scientific research will be helpful, because several things can be done, well, to develop new classes of antibiotics, but so far this is not that impressive. And by the way, the industry, the companies, they are not interested because there is no market. So back to the issue of regulation of who do what and how. This is important. But still, there is research on it. And also there is the possibility to vaccinate against bacteria that are antibiotic resistant. Hopefully this is going to work one day. So, but probably the most important point, beyond surveillance, of course, again, epidemiological surveillance of bacteria, but that's done pretty well, at least in the Western world, is to reduce the misusage of antibiotics a little bit by doctors. They still are prescribing antibiotics, especially in France, too frequently, but also, and more importantly, in the veterinarian world.
maybe I have one question. So I'm the financial economist and also dean of faculty. I just want to ask the question on scientific part. For our research, it takes 5, 7 years sometime to publish and really draw conclusions scientifically for many theories and so on and so forth. I'm interested to know, when I read some of those research during pandemic, they have like very few observations. Of course, there's the risk of the conclusion from those small number of observation with a very short period of time without control group to really, I'm very fascinating about the design, and I know that is difficult is because it's a crisis. I just want to know like how the decision was made. Even among scientific, we know that they have some uncertainty on the conclusion from those type of research because it's very short to study and so on and so forth. I just want to know, like, do you have a committee of scientific who vote on did it should be the risk that is minimal, what is the maximum risk, and so on and so forth, or how you cooperate also with scientific outside the country? Because I think many countries, they also do the same thing. Maybe they draw different conclusions. Just only curious to know how the decision was made.
So there were advisory groups. I mentioned that, the Conseil scientifique in France. And at least at the beginning, or even during the course of the pandemic, the role of these people who are able to propose models of how the waves will evolve. These are not predictions, but projections. That help. And they were, by the way, although they were criticized, actually they were pretty good. And there were people who did that in France. We had good people at Pasteur, at INSERM, very good people in UK, for instance, also, and in other countries. And of course, these people, they talk each other all the time, every day by email and so on. So the informations, as limited as they were, because of course, of the short amount of time that had occurred since the beginning, at least were made available, I would almost to everyone, because the exchange, I mean, and there was a huge mobilization of people, of scientists, of course, epidemiologists, but virologists and pharmacologists and so on. So that informations could be put together rather rapidly. I would say globally, the collaboration between scientists was good, including with China, but we should not forget that the sequence of the virus was made available by the Chinese in early January of 2020. So they from 1 month, they were not so open in giving informations of the cases that were developing in Wuhan, but past these first months of where they were not completely open, then they provided, I mean, as soon as scientists in China sequenced the genome of the virus, it was made available worldwide. And this was very important to develop very rapidly diagnostic tests and then the vaccine. So it was not too bad.
It's me again. Well, the question I had in mind was, in retrospect, now that vaccines, we have a lot more data on them, mostly about the COVID one, do you have anything you would have done differently when it comes to the enforcing of the vaccine on the younger population, from mostly the 12 to 17-year-olds? Because as was the main reason for this vaccination in the first place, to stop the spread, because it was widely believed by the scientific community that the vaccine completely eradicated the spread of the virus, from the news I've seen. And today we realize that it doesn't stop the spread of it. But I'm conscious that my grandma, for example, who's 85 and who has a respiratory disease in the past, she probably lived because of the COVID vaccine and did some incredible things for people. But for the younger one, does it really stop the spread, or was that a good decision to enforce it that much?
It didn't stop the spread, but it contributed to slow down the spread, because it's a little bit complicated based on some immunological information. But once you are vaccinated, for the, say, on average, next 2 to 3 months, you have enough antibodies that can neutralize the virus, then go into your nose and the throat where the infection occurs, so that you are able to block the dissemination of the virus. So it's not a black and white situation. By the way, at the beginning, we didn't know. Even when it was vaccination of teenagers started, we didn't have that information. So there was the hope to stop the propagation of the virus. This is not the case, but it is also not the case that it doesn't do anything. It does something for 2 to 3 months, so which is not neglectable. The same thing is important, for instance, for health workers. So even as a posteriori, it justifies that it was a good decision to vaccinate the teenagers.
Hello, sir. I'm there.
Okay.
When it comes to trust, I had a question. I do believe that French people trust scientists way more than politicians. And also when it comes to what happened in the beginning of the pandemic, the government did quite poorly. So don't you think it would be better off to have scientists deciding whether we should implement a lockdown or this kind of measures?
Definitely not. This is true for pandemics, but this is true for all aspects in the society. I think you can ask the questions again for the next conferences in different topics about, I don't know, climate or whatever. I don't remember what will be the topics of the next conferences. I mean, the scientists should never take the decision. The scientists provide, as well as they can, the best possible information. Sometimes it could be controversial, or we don't know. All of these possibilities do exist. But for a politician to take a decision, of course, it has to take into account very seriously the scientific expertise, but there are other issues. There is the economical issue, there are political issues, again, trust, that is not fully related to what the scientists think. So they have to take all of this. For instance, this was a balance for France. It occurred about the decision by Macron not to lock down again at the beginning of 2021, where there was a new wave and quite a number of cases. He bet that we could go through without a lockdown. And he took that decision against the scientific community, who was in majority at least, in favor of a lockdown. But probably, at the end of the day, probably he was right. It's difficult to tell because, of course, you can argue that they were more deaf, blah, blah, blah. But still, France went through without too much damage. So it's very difficult to take such decisions. And the important point is that the scientific expertise provides a major element for the decision, but there are others unrelated to science that have to be taken into account. So this is why politicians have to take the decision. And by the way, we are in democracy. Of course, it's different in countries that are not democratic. And the government represents the population. They have been elected, and this counts. This is important.
So, regarding not the vaccination, but before, did governments rationalize somehow the lesson learned from pandemics? So, the first breakout of COVID, where there has been a lockdown and everything, for having a more impactful and faster response to pandemics. So, like, if it happens again in 5 years, do we expect to have again the general confusion that starts, or they actually created some procedures to be ready for the next one?
I don't know. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle. What the government in France realized that they needed a group of experts to be able very rapidly, within 1 day, sometimes within hours, to provide some information to advise the government. Because the bodies that exist in France were not fully appropriate in health, I mean, to provide this information. So that's what Macron and the government realized. In other countries, it was already existing. For instance, in UK, they had the so-called SAGE committee, it was a committee of experts that was established at the time of the Med-Cow crisis in UK. And the SAGE committee did the job for the COVID. It was ready to go immediately. Whereas in France, it had to be created, but rapidly, and then it worked reasonably well, I think. So now, for instance, in France, there is a committee named COVARS that has taken over, that is working. So it's a group of experts in different fields, scientific field, and they are advising the government about preparedness and what to do next. So this is helpful, but of course today on the agenda of the politicians, pandemics is no longer there. So that makes, which is understandable, by the way. But so that makes things a little bit in between. And as I said, the resources required to be fully prepared are not there, even in rich countries. Nowhere, I think. Nowhere.
Thanks.
I think we have one question there, right before.
How do you think Europe and France can balance with the need of scientific cooperation, international scientific cooperation, and the goal of strengthening health sovereignty? Thank you.
Yeah, there are different things here. In terms of scientific research, obviously in the field of microbiology, infectious diseases, epidemiology, so pandemics potentially, there is the need to collaborate and to collaborate better than what happened in the context of COVID. There were some, for instance, clinical trials that worked internationally, but not enough. I mean, the European community was not strong enough to provide the resources to give incentives to scientists to work together. This should be done in a much better way. In terms of health, there is something interesting happened, is that for the very first time, the European Union decided to buy a drug, actually a vaccine or several vaccines, together and then to distribute to all of the European population within the European Union. This is the very first time. And I think this is an advance that hopefully could be extended to other drugs. Because the advantage is, one, you can negotiate cheaper price. This is not neglectable given the prices of these things. Second is a way to ensure that at least in Europe there is a fair distribution of vaccines to everyone. So that was an advance. That's a good point, and I think this will be useful for the future.
Hi, thank you very much. Coming from a biological and a genetic background, it's really an honor to have this opportunity to talk with you and to interact with you. Looking back and bouncing back on a lot of questions that we had, I really realized that education in the whole population about pandemics, but also about viruses and microbes, etc., and infection in general is crucial to prevent as soon as possible the spread of those microbes. Do you know if post-COVID we have new programs that have been made to educate the future leaders of the countries or to educate the future decision makers?
You are here. That's
true. Yes, I mean we're super privileged for that, but I'm pretty sure other political schools or any decision maker building schools would benefit a lot from having those educational courses in science and health as well. So yeah, I was wondering if you knew of any program that were being thought about.
I fully agree with you. We are not yet there, but clearly what is starting tonight with you, as Antoine Triller said in his talk, hopefully will be extended to other schools, including the INSP, ex-École Nationale d'Administration, as well as Sciences Po and so on, so where the future deciders are trained. This is clear that they need to be made much more acquainted with science, generally speaking, not only microbiology and also, of course, the issues related to science that are important for their future career. But this is health, but also climate, energy, and there are many topics. And this is true, and for that, France is pretty weak, that the scientific culture of the people who are taking decision is weak, and we have to do better. Some countries have better organized this, like in UK, there is a scientific advisors besides every single minister. This is not the case in France, for instance. So the place of experts is not what it should be done. So there are two things here: to have experts everywhere where decisions are taken, but also this relates to the scientific culture, the understanding by the politicians, but also I think the economical deciders, that it is important for them to have scientific advisors working, I would say, on a daily basis with them. And this is working much better in the Anglo-Saxon world. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's working much better in the Anglo-Saxon world as well as in Germany. And in Germany, actually, it works with our colleagues from the German Scientific Academy, who are in very frequent contact with, for instance, the Prime Minister of Germany. We have to do better in France.
Thank you very much.
I promise this is the last one. And this one is a lot more journalistical. If politicians, they have the habit of expressing their opinions and then going and debating about it so the whole world can see it. When it comes to scientists, a lot of times, unfortunately, it looks like each one of you is in a little space and saying this one is wrong and saying this one is wrong. If today you had the opportunity, if you had the opportunity to debate Didier Raoult, for instance, would you do it? And if not, what would you at least tell him?
This is an important question because that question came to me, and my answer was no. The Raoult or similar people, because if you accept that, that is, you accept that we are talking about opinions and not scientific facts. Okay, and this, to my opinion, should not be accepted. Then, of course, we have to go to the media, and I think what is true is that scientists do not go that often to the media. Many of us, unfortunately, are a bit afraid of talking to the media, but I think the scientific community has to be, perhaps it's moving today, a bit more mobilized and should realize that it is important to explain, educate the people, and provide the right informations, but not to talk on an equal way with the people providing the fake news. Never. Because this is really relativism we just want to avoid.
What do you recommend in terms of regarding vaccines for people who has a disease, or like in terms of diabetes or getting dialysis? Do you recommend that they should still get vaccinated? Because yeah, I've seen a case of like my grandfather, for example, where like he had a symptom of a certain, I would say, disease, and then when he got vaccinated, he was told by a hospital in Korea that he had cancer, and suddenly rapidly just spread it super fast, which was very shocking. And I have family members who has diabetes and who has done dialysis before in the past. That makes me concerned. Is it really the right thing that they're getting another vaccine in the future if they have to?
Well, COVID is not completely over. I mean, this summer there were many cases of COVID. And I think the people at risk of severe COVID have to be protected. And these people at risk are people like me who are beyond 65, unfortunately. And also the sick people you mentioned, those with diabetes, with obesity and other risk factors. So those people have to be vaccinated once a year at least.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other question? Okay.
As an immunologist, do you believe that former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's attempt at herd immunity was a viable strategy?
I mean, this was not only Boris Johnson's opinion. By the way, Boris Johnson's opinion was based on his advisors, who were great people. The guy named Patrick Valiant, who is now the Minister of Research in the new government in UK. He's a fantastic guy. So this was not a crazy idea, despite it was propagated by Boris Johnson, because at the beginning of the pandemics, there was the possibility, it was an hypothesis, but that if, say, given what we knew about the rate of transmission of the virus, that if, say, approximately 70% of the population would have been protected either by vaccination or because they had an infection, maybe the infection will stop. That was possible, but that would have implied that the virus does not mutate. For instance, let's take the example of measles. Measles, the virus is very stable, but very transmissible. But we know that if we were able to vaccinate 95, well, it's a lot, but 95% of the population, the virus will disappear. And that this is herd immunity. So herd immunity was an hypothesis. Unfortunately, it turned out to be wrong, but that was observed after 6-9 months, because it was observed that there was new variants of the viruses that occurred that were partially resistant, and so on. But the initial hypothesis, Boris Johnson or not, forget it, was correct. But just it happened that data showed it was wrong. But still, it was a reasonable assumption.
Okay, we have 10 minutes left, so perhaps a few more questions, but yeah, please.
Yeah, I have a question because I maybe would be a future manager, and so I have a question about the management of public money. We already mentioned the utility of public funding, like the 10 billion from the US, and also we mentioned the utility of pharmaceutical companies. Do you think that, as a scientist, the public money should be given to the pharmaceutical companies in exchange of future hypothetical profit benefits in order to pay back their first investment? And it will also reduce the scandals about public death, especially in France, where we have a big problem, big issue with this.
I'm not sure I will relate to connect that with the debt. I'm not sure. But still, the first point is correct. I think it was wise to provide very rapidly a huge amount of money to speed up, and it worked, the development of vaccines. It didn't work so well for drugs, but I mean, you can't predict everything. But what I would say is that then when there is a negotiation with a given company, a big pharma, okay, we will provide you, say, with $2 billion so that you will make, I don't know, 5 billion of doses of the vaccine, but I want you to distribute half of them to countries with low resources. That would be personally the condition I would put into the negotiation, to have a much fairer distribution of vaccines, which again is absolutely critical for the future.
Well, all right. One last question, then here.
Can I ask a question?
Okay.
Yeah, so you mentioned about global cooperation. So, and in the slides as well, you mentioned how WHO failed in on various fronts. So what are your thoughts on global cooperation and institutions like WHO and for further
I didn't say
pandemics?
WHO failed. I
No,
said
like,
it's
but
weak that they have problems,
Yes.
not enough resources, political fight. I mean, there was the US, China, and others. But we need, I mean, maybe it's a bit like the UN. Everyone is criticizing the UN for good reasons, but it would be worse if there will be no UN. And I think it's even more important for WHO. We need a global organization that can, do what they do today, that is to decide at one time that there is a pandemic, for instance, that measures should be taken, but also to try to coordinate as much as possible the efforts of the different regions of the globe. Not to say that there shouldn't be initiatives in Europe, in Africa, in America, South America, and so on, but we need a global collaboration because these microbes, they don't stop at borders. And then resources are not the same in different countries, and WHO may help with difficulties, obviously, but may help to have a fair distribution of resources worldwide.
Thank you.
And the last one.
Bonsoir, Professor. So my question is, because we've seen rapid advancements in medtech and e-health in recent years, do you think this could, in future pandemics, further widen the gap between wealthier countries and lower income ones? Or do you think this could actually be used as a way to bridge those disparities in healthcare? Thank you.
Well, I don't know well enough. I think, like for the other things, the IA facilities and knowledge is today present in big companies in the Western world. And most of the research on IA today is private and is with Google and the other ones. And this is an issue again, because the availability of data that are generated, the fairness of the data that are generated may be questionable one day. I'm not that optimistic, I'm sorry to say, about this.
All right. Well, thank you for everyone's participation. I'm sorry for the people who had questions and couldn't ask them, but I think it's always better for Mr. Fischer to have too many questions than to end up the conference without any at the end. And maybe just to wrap up very quickly in a few words, you have in this room many people from different programs. They won't all be in the same sectors, but they will be doing different things. But most of us will be taking decisions where we will be. So what do you have to say to future decision makers right here?
Be open to the advances of science, follow them, discuss with scientists, and use us, ask us advices to take the best possible decisions.
All right. Thanks a lot. Quick auto-promotion for what's coming. So we have a few other conferences with the Academy of Science. I think it's 6, correct? Yeah. So 3 before January, 3 after January. So stay tuned for that with different experts like Mr. Fischer, but on different topics. And on our side too, on the society side, we're also doing a cycle on immigration it will be between October and November, I think. So stay tuned for that too. And we are recruiting people, so you can follow us on social media, and if you're interested, just reach out. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Fischer.